I remember the way time seemed to slow down that morning, as if the world itself knew something important was about to happen. The sky outside the hospital windows was pale and overcast, the kind of gray that feels heavy but calm at the same time. I sat in a plastic chair that was far too stiff, my coat folded neatly on my lap, my hands resting on top of it, as if that might steady my racing heart. Every few minutes, I glanced toward the double doors at the end of the hallway, half expecting them to swing open and reveal my son's familiar face. I had been awake since before dawn, unable to sleep. I kept replaying memories in my mind, my son as a baby, wrapped in a blanket not much bigger than the one tucked inside my purse now. I remembered the weight of him in my arms, the way his tiny fingers curled around mine as if he already understood that I was his safety. That memory had stayed with me all these years, through every challenge, every sacrifice, every moment when life felt heavier than I thought I could carry. This was supposed to be another one of those moments. The birth of his child, my grandchild. I imagined myself standing beside his hospital bed later, smiling as he introduced me proudly. I imagined laughter, maybe tears, maybe even an apology for the distance that had grown between us over the past few years. I told myself that a new life had a way of healing old wounds. I believed that. Hours passed, nurses came and went. Other families filled the hallway with soft excitement, whispers, and quiet celebration. Some held balloons, others clutched coffee cups with shaking hands. I watched them all, wondering if they felt what I felt. That strange mix of fear, joy, and hope that comes when life is about to change forever. When the door finally opened, my heart leapt so hard it felt like it might break through my chest. I stood up instantly, my knees weak, my breath caught halfway between anticipation and relief. But when I saw my son, something inside me shifted. He didn't smile. His eyes were tired, yes, but more than that, they were guarded. He didn't step toward me. He stopped several feet away, as if there were an invisible line between us that he didn't want to cross. "Mom," he said, the way he said it, flat, almost formal, sent a chill through me. "Is everything okay?" I asked quickly, "Is the baby all right? Is she all right?" "They're fine," he said. Relief washed over me so strongly that my legs nearly gave out. "Thank God," I whispered. "Can I see him? Just for a minute." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down the hallway, then back at me, his jaw tightening as if he were bracing himself. "There's something you need to understand," he said. My smile faded. "What is it?" He took a slow breath, the kind people take when they're about to say something they know will hurt. "You don't belong here anymore." For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. The words didn't fit together. They didn't make sense. They sounded like a sentence that belonged in someone else's story, not mine. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "Emily doesn't want too many people around." He continued, his voice steady but distant. "She says this is just for immediate family." I stared at him, my mind struggling to catch up. "I am immediate family," I said. "I'm your mother." He shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. "Things are different now. Different." That word echoed in my head, louder than everything else. "I just want to see my grandson," I said. "I won't stay long." He shook his head. "Not today." There was no anger in his voice. No hesitation, just finality, and then he turned away just like that. He didn't wait for my response. He didn't look back. He walked through the door and disappeared, leaving me standing alone in the hallway with my heart breaking quietly inside my chest. I don't remember much about the walk to the parking lot. I know I passed people who were laughing, people who were crying with happiness, people whose lives had just changed for the better. I remember the sound of my shoes against the floor, steady and controlled, as if my body knew that falling apart in public wasn't an option. The cold air outside hit my face, and that was when everything I had been holding back finally spilled over. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, my chest tight, my vision blurred with tears. I cried until my shoulders ached, until my throat burned, until the silence around me felt unbearable. I cried for the baby I hadn't met. I cried for the son I didn't recognize. And I cried for the years of my life that suddenly felt invisible. His father had died when he was still young. From that moment on, it was just the two of us. I learned how to be everything at once: mother, father, provider, protector. I worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, coming home exhausted, but still finding the strength to help with homework, cook meals, and listen to his stories. I missed sleep, I missed rest, I missed parts of myself, but I never regretted it. He was worth it. Every sacrifice felt like an investment in his future, and now, standing alone in that parking lot, I wondered when I had stopped being part of it. The days that followed were painfully quiet. I kept my phone close, convinced it would ring at any moment. I told myself that he was overwhelmed, that once things settled down, he'd call, he'd apologize. He'd explain, but the phone stayed silent. I sent a message asking how the baby was doing. It went unread. I mailed a small gift I had bought months earlier, wrapped carefully with a handwritten note. It came back unopened. That hurt more than I expected. I began seeing things online instead: photos, smiles, captions filled with words like family and blessed. Emily's parents were always there, holding the baby, celebrating milestones I wasn't allowed to witness. I wasn't mentioned, not once. It slowly became clear that this wasn't temporary. I wasn't being forgotten. I was being excluded. At first, the loneliness was overwhelming. I questioned everything. I replayed conversations, searching for the moment where I might have crossed a line. I wondered if loving from a distance had been mistaken for indifference. I wondered if staying quiet had made me easy to push aside. But eventually, the sadness gave way to something else: clarity. I realized that I had spent my entire life showing up for others, fixing things, holding people together, and now, for the first time, I was being forced to decide whether I would keep chasing people who didn't want me, or choose myself. So I stopped reaching out, not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared enough about myself to stop begging for a place in someone else's life. I filled my days differently. I volunteered at a community center, helping young mothers who reminded me of myself years ago: tired, scared, determined. I listened to their worries. I shared my experiences. I became someone safe for them. I read books I'd never had time for before. I took long walks. I learned how to sit in silence without feeling empty. I learned that being alone didn't have to mean being lonely. Years passed. Time softened some of the pain, though it never fully disappeared. I wondered about my grandson often. I imagined his laugh, his voice, the way his eyes might look when he smiled. I carried him in my heart, even if I wasn't allowed to carry him in my arms. And then, one evening, my phone rang. I stared at the screen, my breath catching when I saw my son's name. My hand hovered there for a long time before I answered. "Mom," he said. His voice sounded different now, older, tired. "I need you," he said. And for the first time, I didn't rush to respond. I stayed quiet for a few seconds after he said those words, not because I didn't hear him, but because I needed to understand how they landed inside me. For so many years, I had lived in a constant state of readiness, ready to help, ready to fix, ready to step in the moment he needed me. Hearing him say, "I need you," again stirred something old and familiar, but it didn't move me the way it once would have. Instead of rushing forward, my heart pulled back, cautious, protective. "Why now?" I asked gently. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost picture him sitting somewhere alone, maybe on the edge of a couch, rubbing his forehead the way he used to when he was overwhelmed as a teenager. "Because I don't know how to do this alone," he finally said. And because I was wrong, those words mattered, but I had learned the hard way that words, by themselves, don't heal anything. He told me bits and pieces over the phone, how the marriage had slowly turned into a battlefield of unspoken expectations and quiet resentment. How Emily had felt judged, controlled, overwhelmed by motherhood, and by the invisible standards she felt she could never meet. How he had felt torn between being a husband and being a son, choosing silence instead of honesty, avoidance instead of understanding. "I thought pushing you away would make things easier," he admitted. "I thought if I drew a clear line, Everything else would fall into place. And did it? I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, no. After we hung up, I sat alone at my kitchen table long after the sun went down. The house was quiet in a way I had grown used to, but that night it felt heavier. I thought about how easily people assume that parents are endlessly forgiving, endlessly available, endlessly willing to absorb pain for the sake of love. I thought about how many times I had lived up to that expectation, and how much it had cost me. The next morning, I called him back. I will meet my grandson. I said calmly, but I need you to understand something. I'm listening, he replied. I'm not coming back to the way things were. I continued. I won't be pushed aside, I won't be erased, and I won't be used only when you're overwhelmed. If I'm in your life, it will be with honesty and respect. If that's too much, then it's better we stay apart. He didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. I understand, he said, and this time there was something different in his voice, something steadier, something real. We agreed to meet a week later. I spent those days in a strange mix of anticipation and fear. I wondered what my grandson would look like, whether he would feel like a stranger to me, whether I would feel like one to him. I wondered if reopening that door would bring healing, or reopen wounds I had worked so hard to close. When the day came, I drove to my son's house slowly, my hands tight on the steering wheel. It looked the same from the outside, but stepping inside felt like entering a different life. Toys were scattered across the living room floor. There were small shoes by the door, tiny jackets hanging on hooks, evidence of a child growing, learning, existing without me. My son opened the door and stepped aside, letting me in without a word. He looked thinner than I remembered, tired in a deeper way than before, and then I saw him. My grandson stood near the couch, holding onto it for balance. He looked up at me with wide eyes, curious and unafraid. "Hi," my son said softly. "This is your grandma." The word hit me like a wave. I knelt down slowly, not wanting to scare him. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. He studied my face for a moment, then smiled. Not a polite smile, not a cautious one, a real open smile. "Grandma," he said, as if the word already belonged to him. Tears filled my eyes instantly. I opened my arms, and without hesitation, he stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around my neck. The weight of him, the warmth, the simple trust in that gesture broke something open inside me that I hadn't realized was still closed. In that moment, I knew that no matter how complicated things became, loving him would never be a mistake. The visit was awkward at first. My son hovered, unsure of where to stand, what to say. We talked about simple things: the weather, his work, the child's routines. Nothing deep, nothing heavy. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding that something fundamental had shifted. I didn't stay long. I had learned the value of leaving before exhaustion or resentment set in. As I walked out, my son stopped me at the door. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For coming back," he replied. I looked at him carefully. "I didn't come back," I said. "I came forward. There's a difference." He nodded, even if he didn't fully understand yet. In the weeks that followed, I visited regularly, but on my terms. I didn't drop everything at the first call. I didn't overextend myself. I showed up when I could, when it felt healthy, when it felt mutual. Slowly, my son began to adjust. He stopped assuming. He started asking. He began to see me not just as a resource, but as a person with boundaries, with needs, with a life of my own. There were moments of tension. Old habits don't disappear overnight. Sometimes he would slip into the same dismissive tone, the same assumptions. And every time he did, I addressed it calmly, firmly. "I won't accept that," I would say, and to his credit he listened. As for Emily, I didn't see her again. She moved away, building a life separate from ours. I held no anger toward her. I understood now that pain doesn't always make people cruel. It often just makes them protective in the wrong ways. My relationship with my grandson grew slowly, naturally. We built rituals together, eating books, taking walks, baking simple things in the kitchen. I let him lead. I let trust grow at its own pace. I didn't try to make up for lost time by overwhelming him with affection. I had learned that love doesn't need to be loud to be deep. One afternoon, as we sat on the floor building something out of blocks, he looked up at me and asked, "Why didn't I see you before?" The question caught me off guard. I took a breath. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. I said gently, "But what matters is that we try to do better." He nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to stacking blocks. Watching him, I realized something important. The pain I had carried for so long wasn't mine to pass on. I didn't need to explain or justify my absence. I didn't need to turn my hurt into his burden. My job now was simply to be present, honest, and loving. Months turned into a year. My relationship with my son continued to evolve. There were hard conversations about accountability, about respect, about the choices he had made and the impact they had. He apologized more than once, not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent ways. He listened more. He assumed less. He learned slowly that love isn't proven by control, but by care. One evening, after putting my grandson to bed, my son sat across from me at the kitchen table. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. "I didn't understand back then," he said. "I thought becoming a father meant cutting myself off from everything that came before. And now," I asked, "now I realize it means learning how to hold more," he said. "Not less." I smiled, not because everything was healed, but because something was growing. There are moments now when I think back to that hospital hallway, to the woman I was then confused, heartbroken, trying to understand how she had suddenly become invisible. I wish I could reach back through time and tell her what I know now, that being told you don't belong doesn't make it true, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, not in anger but in self-respect. That choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop loving others. It just means you stop losing yourself in the process, and that the choices you make in silence often shape your life more than the words you speak out loud. As time passed, I began to notice how much I had changed without even realizing it. I used to measure my worth by how needed I was, how quickly I could fix problems, how much of myself I was willing to give away. Now I measured it differently, by how peaceful I felt when I woke up in the morning, by whether my presence was welcomed rather than assumed, by whether my voice was heard instead of tolerated. My grandson grew quickly, the way children always do. Every visit brought a new word, a new habit, a new piece of his personality unfolding like a story I was finally allowed to read. He loved asking questions, loved listening to the sound of his own laughter, loved the simple joy of being noticed. When he held my hand, he did it with a quiet confidence, as if he had already decided that I was someone safe. That trust humbled me. There were days when my son struggled. Single parenthood weighed heavily on him, and sometimes his exhaustion slipped into frustration. On those days, I didn't rush in to rescue him the way I once would have. Instead, I listened. I asked questions. I offered support without taking control. It wasn't always easy for him to accept, but over time, he began to understand that strength doesn't come from doing everything alone. It comes from knowing when to share the load. One afternoon, while my grandson napped, my son sat across from me on the porch. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the yard. He looked thoughtful, distant. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked suddenly. I knew exactly which day he meant. "Yes," I said honestly. "I do. I replay it sometimes," he admitted. "I wish I could take it back." "You can't," I replied gently, "but you can learn from it." He nodded slowly. I didn't realize how final my words sounded. I thought I was setting boundaries. I didn't understand I was breaking something. "That's the thing about words," I said. "Once they're spoken, they live longer than we expect." He was quiet after that. Later that evening, after I returned home, I sat alone with my thoughts. I realized how close I had come to disappearing completely, not just from their lives, but from my own. If I had kept chasing approval, kept shrinking myself to fit into spaces where I wasn't valued, I would have lost something far more important than a role in my son's family. I would have lost myself. Instead, I had chosen something harder. I had chosen distance over desperation, silence over argument, self-respect over familiarity, and that choice had reshaped everything. There were moments of grief along the way. Grief for the years I had missed, for the memories that would never be made. But grief, I learned, doesn't mean regret. It simply means something mattered. As my grandson grew older, he began asking deeper questions about family, about feelings, about why some people leave together and others don't. I answered honestly but carefully, always mindful that he didn't need the weight of adult pain on his small shoulders. Families can change. I told him once, but love doesn't disappear. It just finds new ways to show up. He seemed to accept that. One evening, while we were walking together, he looked up at me and said, "I like when you're here." Those simple words filled a space inside me I hadn't known was empty. My relationship with my son continued to evolve, uneven but real. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't rush forgiveness. Instead, we built something new, something slower, more honest, more balanced. There were still moments when old wounds flared, moments when his tone reminded me of that hospital hallway, when the ache returned unexpectedly. But now I didn't swallow it. I spoke up. That hurt, I would say, and instead of dismissing me, he listened. That was progress. One night, after my grandson had fallen asleep, my son handed me a cup of tea and said, "I don't think I ever thanked you properly." "For what?" I asked. "For not giving up on us," he said, "even when I made it easy for you to walk away forever." I met his gaze. I didn't stay because it was easy. I said, "I stayed because I learned how to stay without losing myself." He nodded, understanding more than he ever had before. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the woman I was before all of this happened. The woman who believed that love meant endless sacrifice, that family bonds were unbreakable simply because they existed. I don't judge her. She did the best she could with what she knew, but I'm grateful for the woman I became, the one who learned that belonging isn't granted, it's claimed, the one who learned that walking away doesn't always mean abandoning love. Sometimes it's the only way to protect it, and the one who learned that the choices we make when no one is watching often become the foundation for everything that follows. The words "you don't belong here anymore" once shattered me. Now they remind me of something powerful. I don't need permission to belong. I never did. Life has a way of settling into a rhythm when you stop fighting it. I noticed it first in the small things. The way mornings no longer felt rushed. The way my breath stayed steady even when conversations grew uncomfortable. The way I no longer rehearsed what I might say if I was questioned, challenged, or dismissed. I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I was simply present. My grandson started school, and with that came new routines, new milestones. The first day he wore his backpack, nearly too big for his small shoulders. He reached for my hand without thinking. That simple instinct, choosing me in that moment, meant more than any apology ever could. It wasn't something he had been told to do. It wasn't something expected. It was natural, and that told me everything I needed to know. My son stood a few steps behind us, watching quietly. I could feel his eyes on us, not with suspicion, but with reflection. Later that day, he admitted, "I didn't realize how much he'd attached to you." I smiled softly. "Children attach to people who make them feel safe." He nodded, thoughtful. "I think I misunderstood safety for a long time." We talked more after that, not just about parenting, but about fear. About how becoming a father had awakened old wounds in him. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of becoming like his own father, whose absence still lingered in quiet ways. He told me that when Emily became pregnant, something inside him panicked. He felt pressure to build a perfect family, to prove he could do it right. And when he felt that slipping, he pushed away anything that reminded him of his vulnerability, including me. Listening to him, I didn't feel anger. I felt understanding, not the kind that excuses pain, but the kind that explains it. "I wish I'd known how scared you were," I said. "I wish I'd known how much I was hurting you," he replied. That conversation didn't erase the past, but it softened it. It allowed both of us to see each other as human, not as roles we were failing to perform. As the years went on, I noticed another change. This one within myself. I stopped feeling the need to prove my place. I didn't worry about where I stood in photos or whether my presence was acknowledged publicly. I knew who I was. I knew what I meant. That quiet certainty was something I had never experienced before. There were family gatherings where I chose not to attend, not out of resentment, but because I recognized my own limits. And there were times when I showed up fully, without hesitation, without fear of being unwelcome. The difference was choice. Every time, one afternoon, my grandson asked me to tell him stories about his father when he was young. We sat on the couch, his head resting against my arm, listening as I described a boy who loved building things, who asked endless questions, who once cried for hours over a broken toy he couldn't fix. "Did Daddy cry a lot?" he asked. "Sometimes," I said. "Crying doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care." He seemed to think about that deeply. Later, my son thanked me for those stories. "I forget sometimes," he said, "that I was allowed to be soft once." "You still are," I replied. "You just learned how to hide it." There came a moment years after that hospital hallway when my son finally said the words I hadn't needed, but had once longed to hear. "I'm sorry," he said, "not just for what I said, but for what I took away." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized that the apology mattered not because it repaired the past, but because it acknowledged it. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said, "not because you deserved it, but because I deserved peace." He nodded, his eyes shining. My grandson grew older, wiser in the way children do when they're loved consistently. He learned my routines, my habits, my stories. He learned that I always kept snacks in my bag, that I hummed when I cooked, that I listened fully when he spoke. And I learned from him, too, how to be present without expectations, how to love without fear of loss. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking about the life that could have been, the birthdays I missed, the first steps I didn't see, the nights I wasn't there to soothe him to sleep. Those thoughts still stung, but they no longer controlled me. They were part of my story, not the whole of it. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun set, my grandson leaned against me and said, "I think families are the people who stay." I smiled. "I think you're right." Later that night, alone in my home, I reflected on how close I had come to believing I didn't belong anywhere at all. How easily that single sentence could have rewritten my entire sense of self. But it didn't. Because I made a choice. I chose to step away instead of shrinking. I chose dignity over desperation. I chose myself, not instead of my family, but for the sake of my soul, and in doing so, I found my way back, not to the place I was pushed out of, but to a stronger, truer version of home. There are moments in life when you don't realize how far you've come until something familiar tries to pull you back. For me, it happened on an ordinary afternoon when my son called, his voice tense in a way I hadn't heard in years. There was a problem at work, a disagreement with someone who questioned his decisions, and for a brief moment I heard the old pattern returning. The defensiveness, the urge to shut down, to push away instead of lean in. I listened carefully as he spoke, letting him empty his thoughts without interruption. When he finally paused, waiting for me to step in and fix it, I didn't. Instead, I asked him what he thought the right next step was. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just wanted to hear your voice." That honesty meant more than any request for advice. It told me he was learning that support doesn't always come in solutions, that being heard can be just as powerful. "You'll figure it out," I said. "You always do." After we hung up, I sat with a sense of quiet pride. Not because my son needed me again, but because he no longer needed me to disappear in order to feel strong. My grandson, too, was learning lessons in his own way. One day, after a disagreement with a friend, he came to me instead of withdrawing. He explained what had happened, his small face serious with concern. "I don't want to stop being friends," he said, "but I don't know how to fix it." I smiled gently. "Sometimes fixing things means listening first." He nodded, absorbing that idea like children do, whole and unquestioning. Watching him grow, I became acutely aware of the legacy we leave behind, not in possessions or achievements, but in patterns, the way we handle conflict, the way we speak when we're afraid, the way we choose connection over control. I realized then that the pain I had endured wasn't meaningless. It had given me insight, patience, depth. It had taught me how to break cycles instead of repeating them. There came a time when my son asked me about that day again, the day he told me I didn't belong. We were sitting together, the house quiet, my grandson asleep in the next room. "Do you ever wish I'd done something different?" he asked. "Of course," I said, "but wishing doesn't change anything." "What does?" he asked. "Choosing differently now," I replied. He nodded slowly. I tried to remember that. And I believed him. As the years continued to unfold, life brought new challenges, as it always does. There were illnesses, disappointments, moments of fear and uncertainty. But there was also laughter, shared meals, small traditions that grew into meaningful rituals. Sunday afternoons at the park, stories before bed, quiet conversations that stretched late into the evening. I learned that healing isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in ordinary moments, in consistency, in the decision to keep showing up with honesty. Sometimes, people would ask me how I managed to forgive. I never knew how to answer that simply. Forgiveness to me wasn't a single act. It was a process, a choice made again and again, to release bitterness, to protect my peace, to move forward without dragging the past behind me. What surprised me most was how forgiveness didn't make me smaller. It made me free. One afternoon, my grandson came home from school with a drawing. It was simple, stick figures holding hands, a house in the background, a sun in the corner. He handed it to me proudly. "That's our family," he said. I looked at the picture closely. There was no hierarchy, no separation, just people standing together. "Do you like it?" he asked. "I love it," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. That night, as I placed the drawing on my refrigerator, I thought about how far I'd come from that hospital hallway, from the woman who walked out feeling invisible, unsure of her place in the world. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was grounded. I had learned that belonging isn't something someone else can give or take away. It's something you build through self-respect, through boundaries, through love that doesn't demand self-erasure. The choice I made back then, to walk away rather than beg, had felt terrifying at the time, but it had been the most powerful decision of my life, because it taught my son how to respect me, it taught my grandson how to trust, and it taught me how to value myself. Life didn't return to what it once was. It became something better, something honest, something earned, and every day I wake up grateful, not for the pain that started it all, but for the strength that grew from it.